All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Making the Argument. Well, Trump's big, beautiful bill does appear to have been able to pass out of committee despite the fact there was some pushback. And quite frankly, there was pushback from members of Congress that we really admire, and I think they brought up some pretty good points. But we can also not forget that Congress has not really done a whole lot. I mean, when you look at the first 100 days and we look at what DOJ has been doing, they've been working really hard. When we look at what the administration has been doing, they've been really active. But Congress, on the other hand, not so much. And the one bright side that we were kind of looking for here was the reconciliation bill. It was this idea of the House of Representatives, the Senate, actually getting the 12 appropriations bills out to form an actual budget that would correct for a lot of the things that DOJ has identified. And while that process does seem to be moving along and potentially in time to actually get things done, because if you remember our talk with Senator Markwayne Mullin, he said it had to be out by the end of July. There's still some problems. So what we're going to discuss today is we're going to talk about DOJ, what it's done, what it's currently doing, and what Congress's response has been to it, and hopefully be able to have some meaningful information that we can give you that can help you actually do the things that are necessary to influence members of Congress to start holding up their end of the bargain. As always, I am your host, Nick Freitas, currently, but not for much longer, a member of the Virginia House of Delegates. So I know what it is to go through budget processes, and I know what it is to vote against a lot of budget bills. With me in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
And then we have our political prognosticator, our resident historian, the Oracle of Virginia, Christian Hines. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well.
Okay.
Christian always gets the best introduction.
I'm sorry, babe. I'll work on your introduction.
Can't we all be cool like Christian?
I'm many things. I'm not cool, Tina.
Everyone agrees they do like the shaved head, though. All right. So listen, getting right into this. I am going to try. I'm going to try to not, I don't know, say or do things that will get me in trouble today, because I'm very visibly frustrated because of a number of things.
Yeah.
And when I look at what's going on right now, one of the biggest hopes I had, and when I did my interview with Antonio Gracias of the DOJ team, after we were done with the interview, no one else saw this, but after we were done with the interview, I said, "Hey, I got to tell you something. I served in the military. I've been in politics." And he goes, "I know. I did my research on you before we did this interview." I said, "Oh, good." I said, "Well, I want you to know that I actually think that what DOJ is doing right now is one of the most consequential things that could be done in order to actually correct for what's going on in this country. And I've dedicated a fair part of my life to trying to fight for the country I love, to try to save it from the things that I think are harmful for it. And I just want you to know that no matter what anyone else says, I really appreciate what you guys are doing, and I hope you'll continue." And he thanked me for that, and we had a good conversation. But I also recognize that this is not even half the equation, right? It's maybe a quarter of it, right? Part of it's the identification of what's going on. Another quarter of it is the Trump administration signing executive orders in order to pull back certain funds or to change policies to the degree that they can within the constitutional powers of the presidency. But half of this is Congress. Congress has to be the one to actually take what is being identified by DOJ, by the executive branch, and then turn it into law, or to write the budgets in such a way to where actually getting rid of the spending that should not exist, or getting rid of departments which should not exist. And I find myself once again in a situation looking at Congress fully controlled by Republicans and thinking, yep, this is why I'm getting out of a legislature here in Virginia. Because I am so frigging tired of the kind of inaction that takes place where everyone is so damn concerned about saving their seat that they are unwilling to do anything that could be perceived as politically unpopular. And it's like, why give you power? Why give you power? Right? I'm a big fan of not concentrating power. But constitutionally, Congress, you have the power to do these things. The reason why you've been granted the power to do these things is because this is the mechanism whereby we adjudicate who holds power through elections. And then we have this system, right, between Congress, between the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. And we have more control over this process than we have had in my lifetime. And nope, not willing to do it. Not to the extent that we should be. Now,
they're not even willing to do what they campaigned to their people that they would do.
Well, and that's because that's a we'll get into this, but I just want to say that it is not all doom and gloom. I need to remember that it's not all doom and gloom, because there are a lot of good things within this reconciliation bill. There are. I'm just tired of feeling like that whenever Democrats are in control, they get what they want. And when we're in control, we get some facsimile of it. We get just enough to not cause us to walk off. And I'm just tired of it. And I don't understand it. I'm looking at Thune, I'm looking at Johnson, and it's like, guys, are you in charge of your respective houses or not? Can you get the legislation through the committee structure? Like, I know you can. I know especially how powerful a speaker is. I know you can do it. And yet we're not. We're not. And I will never forget going up to DC when I was about to go up to the White House, and we were going to talk to members of the administration. We did. We got to talk to a lot of great people. Rubio, RFK, JD Vance, Donald Trump. Got to talk to all of them. And I remember asking at that point, I was like, well, look, you know, I love what DOJ is doing, but when is Congress going to act on what DOJ is doing? When do you write the budget amendments, right? When do the budget amendments get into those 12 appropriation bills? When do you start passing, the rescission bills? When do you start passing the legislation to get rid of some of these departments or agencies? Because, by the way, we don't even have an actual, think about this fact for a second. We do not even have an actual count of the number of federal agencies that exist. We know the major departments, but all of the various groups and organizations and agencies and bureaus, we don't even have a complete number. There's no one place you can go to get a complete number of all the agencies. But I'll tell you this much, they don't all need to exist. Go look at Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. They do not all need to exist, and yet they do. So why? And I had a member of Congress who I generally respect. And they look at me and they say, well, Nick, you know, we've got really slim majorities in the House, but I think we're going to pick up some seats in the midterms, and we pick up those seats, then we'll be able to do something. And at that moment, I remember going up there just so excited and so enthusiastic and thinking, I've heard this before. And the member of Congress that said this did not know I'm a member of a state legislature and that I'm very, very familiar with the various vernacular that's used. Mm-hmm. And the thing that gave me hope again is I went into the White House the next day, and I asked the question of the press secretary, Caroline Leavitt. And then I asked the question of the vice president. And their attitude was like, no, we've got to act now. And I was like, okay, good. The executive branch is on board, right? They know that we don't have 4 years to do this. We got to do everything. We got to do as much as we can within the first 2. Have to. And then I got to speak with Speaker Johnson. I said, Speaker Johnson, a member of your caucus said this. Do you agree? No. We have to act now. Well, here's what I'm saying. For the most part, I think the executive branch is delivering on that promise. I'm going to say this right now. I don't like everything the executive branch is doing. I like the vast majority of it. And a lot of the stuff they're doing, I don't just like, I love, like I voted for this. Yes, I did.
You don't have to absolutely love all of it.
Don't got to love all of it, but I love most of it. And that's why I'm enthusiastically supporting the administration. However, I look at some of these other people and it's like, once again, are you just telling me what you thought I wanted to hear? And did you think that you would get away with it? And the answer is yes. Yes, they do.
Because that member
they have.
I think that member was much more concerned with their child care for congressman bills.
Yeah, we'll see. But look, the bottom line is like all hope is not lost. So we're going to get into some of the things that DOJ is currently doing, because DOJ has actually moved on to some different objectives right now. That isn't to say they gave up the old things they were doing, but they have started looking at some new objectives, which gives me confidence that they are still focused on what their primary mission is, which is to identify things that should not exist, and for the things that still should exist, making them more efficient and operating the way that they should. So DOJ seems to be very focused on that, and I'm very happy about that because, quite frankly, you know, that's what we need. It's like, don't make more efficient that which shouldn't exist, but that which should exist should be efficient and effective, just like Good Ranchers. Because if you want an efficient way to actually bring steak to your door, and I don't mean just any steak, I'm gonna be honest here for a second, and I feel bad about this. I feel bad to admit this. I had a steak the other day that was not Good Ranchers, and you know what? I can immediately tell. Like, Good Ranchers has spoiled me to like no degree. I mean, it's crazy now. I've gotten so used to eating Good Rancher steak that the moment I had a different steak that was high quality, right? It wasn't bad quality. It was a good quality steak, but it was like, it's just not the same. That's the magic of getting your steak or your poultry or your seafood, right? Or your pork through a company that not only has the best deals with some of the best American farmers and ranchers out there, right? But is absolutely committed to the sort of the values that we share here at Making the Argument. So go to goodranchers.com right now. Go over their shop and subscribe, because it's not just about, now if you want, maybe you want to date Good Ranchers first and you just want to try something, fine, go ahead and do a one-time order. But then you sign up for the subscription. And if you use my exclusive code, Nick, you go in there, you use Nick as the code. When you check out, you're going to get free meat and you're going to get an extra $40 off your order. So you're not only going to avail of yourself of some of the best beef, pork, poultry, wild-caught seafood you've ever had, delivered straight to your door, super convenient, but you're also going to be supporting a great American-run company, and you're going to be supporting this show. So go out there and just help everybody all at once. GoodRanchers.com. Use our exclusive code Nick. Get that additional free meat with your order. All right. Where are we at with Doge, Christian?
So let's start with the good news for once, rather than the doom and gloom. Don't worry, we'll get to that. So the good news is that Doge has identified so far, as of the recording of this podcast, $170 billion worth of waste.
Yep.
And, a huge chunk of that is really just money that's being funneled into the left, right? I mean, it's...
The single most important thing that they've done, I've said this before. I was speaking, I can't remember where I was at. I was like, you know what? We keep saying that they identified waste. But understand something, the people that were spending this money didn't see it as waste at all. They
viewed it as essential.
Oh, this was the biggest coup they could have possibly launched, because they got to take your tax dollars and then give it to their nonprofits to push their agenda on your children. And not just your children, but children in like Uzbekistan, right? Like this was, for them, this was the biggest. We used to talk about this in the military, that it is one thing to defeat your enemy in battle, right? You got your troops, you got your munitions, but when you then like take their supplies and then use their supplies against them, like it's a double whammy, right? That's what they were doing. That's what the left was doing. They had completely mobilized a significant portion of the federal budget and everything else in order to go after, again, to fund their agendas. And to give you an idea, because we hear so much about trillions in the United States that, anything under $1 trillion, we're like, are we even talking about real money anymore? If you have a budget, $170 billion is a bigger annual GDP than like 100 countries in the world. Like over 100 countries have an annual GDP of less than 100 billion. So yeah, this was a lot of money that was being used to push a left-wing ideological agenda. And Doge finding that it's not just been good because your money's not being spent in a way that you don't like. It's because we've seen some of the protests and things like that you notice these like massive big protests that take place that are just incredibly well coordinated, and they're not happening to the same degree or intensity. I wonder why that is. Oh, because they don't have access to your tax dollars to fund it anymore. So look, that's super gold star, like big gold star for Doge and the Trump administration.
And we will get back to this point at the end of the podcast, because this is not just for the reasons that you brought up, but this is actually incredibly important when we think about the implications of where we are and where we're going.
Yeah.
Because, we will get to the doom and gloom in a little bit, but don't worry, we will circle back around to this point near the end, because this needs to be reiterated, and you'll understand once we get to the end of the podcast. Right. So there's another piece of good news. In addition to the savings and also the defunding of certain left-wing institutions, there's another piece of good news in the form of, this is new.
Yeah.
The regulations tab. So by the way, let me just explain this for the audio listeners. What we currently have up right now is a website that tracks Doge's progress, that tracks the work that they do. It's literally called, you can go check it yourself. It's called doge.gov. And what this podcast does, what this website does, what this podcast does, we'll have to leave that in. What this website does is it shows the work that Doge is doing in identifying waste. This is where, they for example, they found the Trans Opera money in Colombia that everybody was talking about a couple months ago. This is all in this website? Well, they added a new tab recently where they're showing regulation cuts, because another critical component of what Trump is trying to do is cut regulations faster than they're being implemented. So this is basically like, the equivalent of the Red Tape Reduction Act that certain Republicans in Washington, D.C. and Congress are trying to push. Well, Trump is basically doing this through executive order. And so DOGE is no longer just cutting wasteful spending. They're also identifying useless regulations. And there's savings that exist in identifying useless regulations and eliminating those as well.
Yeah.
So they have two metrics that they're tracking right now. One is savings in the form of regulations being eliminated, and the other one is words that are deleted.
Yeah.
From federal registries that track regulations. And so those are two really interesting metrics. So on the savings front, we've got almost 30 billion in savings, 28.7 right now. And on the word count, look at this.
Well, to give you an idea,
337,000 words deleted.
By 2016, there were 104.6 million words of federal regulation on the books, about 195% growth over 1970. So yeah, there's a lot of there's another book out there. What is it? 3 Felonies a Day, where it talks about you could an otherwise reasonable law-abiding citizen could potentially commit up to 3 felonies a day because there's so many federal regulations that you could be doing something and have no idea. But that's the sort of problems that we're talking about. And to give someone, let me illustrate this with a story, because this is a combination of how federal regulations and state regulations end up colliding. I had somebody, a constituent, come up to me and be like, Nick, all I'm trying to do is build a brewery. I got my permits, I got my heavy equipment out there. I've been doing this. DEQ says I need stream credits, but then when I ask them how I'm supposed to do it, they say to go to Army Corps. DEQ is Department of Environmental Quality. It's a state agency in Virginia. Army Corps of Engineers, which is federal, they say, no, or you got to do this. And then when I ask DEQ for an answer, they send me to Army Corps of Engineers. And when I ask Army Corps of Engineers for an answer, they send me to DEQ. So I'm going through that. I'm calling up now and I'm like, hey, what's the deal? And DEQ send me to Army Corps of Engineers. And I go to Army Corps and they're sending me back to DEQ. And so finally I'm like, I want you guys to come out to the site and we're going to look at the site. So we get out there. We got all the heavy equipment, right? He's on there. He's already started some, construction and stuff like that, but now he's had to stop. Why? Because he gets this threat that, well, we don't know if you're violating the law, but if you are violating the law, it's going to be a $25,000 a day fine. Okay, I won't do anything. How do I not violate the law? Well,
don't do anything.
We're not sure, right? I'm like, okay, this is crap, right? And I even told him, I said, guys, the answer may be no. If the answer is no, tell him it's no, so he can remove this stuff and not have to pay to have this stuff sit out here. Well, we're not sure. And I'm like, okay, he wants stream credits. He wants to be able to do stream credits so he can do this over here. Can he get stream credits? Well, we'd have to see the stream. Get in your cars. And so I had them drive with me. Like we drove maybe 1.5 miles up a dirt road to where the stream was on the property. And the stream that we're talking about is like so tiny, I can put my foot on one bank and my foot on the other bank. So now I'm standing there. I got Army Corps of Engineers on one side. I got DEQ on the other side. I said, okay, here's the stream. Here it is. You saw the building site. You see the stream. Can he get stream credits to continue construction over there? And I kid you not, at the same time, one of them said yes and the other said no. And I said, this is what drives people up the freaking wall. What is the answer? Do you need legislation? Do we need a bill? Because I know a guy who can carry a bill in the Virginia House of Delegates. It's me. So do we need a bill? Well, no, we don't need a bill. This is what we're talking about. When DOGE talks about cutting the sort of regulations, people don't understand that a lot of the times the reason why something that you want to do is so expensive or takes so long or becomes such a problem is because of millions of words of regulations that can potentially contradict one another, run into state law, create issues of jurisdiction, like all of it. All of it. That's how utterly ridiculous it has gotten. And guess what? To this day, we've still never fixed the problem that I was trying to deal with. That was years ago. Why? Because federal and state. I could change something at the state level, but then the feds could come back down and be like, oh no, waters of the United States. Now, waters of the United States, by the way, is an EPA regulation which is meant to handle things like the Mississippi River. But they've turned it into any water that potentially impacts another watershed is now jurisdiction of the EPA, Army Corps of Engineers. You got to get all these approvals. And it just becomes this way for bureaucrats to shut everything down. Or, this is the other part to remember, or it becomes a way for bureaucrats to give special favors to the people they like. And that also happens. So
I don't have the chart in front of me. In part because I just thought of it 5 seconds ago, but there is a chart, if you go searching on the internet, that tracks the size of the federal code, and then it illustrates when word processing was invented.
Yeah.
And it just goes parabolic, right? It ends up looking like, Bitcoin's price chart or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's just really interesting how as it got easier to create, it's not really surprising if you think about it, as it got easier to create mass numbers of regulations, lo and behold, that's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
And now we get to a point where, going back to what you were saying earlier, the federal government doesn't even really know how many people work for the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
We don't even have an accurate assessment of how many departments and agencies and sub-agencies there are. And by the way, we have a significant number of people outside the US that listen to our podcast. Like, we have plenty of listeners in Canada and Australia and the UK. In the UK, it's even worse because they have these things called quangos. They're quasi-government agencies. They're similar to like NGOs where, by the way, you are not an NGO if 90% of your funding is coming from the taxpayer. That is not what an NGO is. But like, it's even worse in some of these European countries or in Canada because, like, for example, when Blair took office in 1997, Tony Blair, former Labour Prime Minister, he set up all these quangos. And so, like, on paper, they're not government agencies. They're actually independent. They're independent in the same way that the post office is independent. But where do they get their funding? Oh, their funding's entirely from Parliament, right? And so, like, and again, we have something very similar. We just don't call them quangos. We call them NGOs. And so it's even more complex than that because it's like, well, all of these semi-independent agencies do a lot of government work, but they have no government accountability. And by the way, they're entirely funded on the taxpayer. Well, isn't that really convenient?
Yeah.
No accountability, but you have to fund everything. And it just so happens that almost every single one of them are pushing the same thing. Why are they all pushing leftism simultaneously?
Yeah.
So just keep that in the back of your mind as we go through this podcast, because we are going to get into the doom portion of the podcast. But keep that in mind because there is a positive element to all of this.
Real quick, Harrison Morgan asked, will or has Doge cut words from the tax code? So again, they've got to be careful on how they do that. So they're not allowed to cut regulations that like significantly alter what Congress has written into law. So here's the difference. A lot of times Congress will write a law that gives broad regulatory power to an executive branch agency. So they say things like, the Department of Environmental Protection or the Environmental Protection Agency will go out and promulgate regulations in order to carry out, the provisions of HB, blah, 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 blah. And what that does is it says, okay, we're not going to tell the agency specifically how to do everything. We're going to give them objectives, and then we're going to tell them to figure it out. And then if we don't like how they figured it out, we can pass a new bill adjusting it. Well, you can see where there's a lot of problems in doing that, right? You've essentially handed over an enormous amount of legislative power to an executive branch agency. By the same token, you could also understand where you wouldn't want Congress to try to specifically write out everything the executive branch agency does, because now you kind of run into these issues with, okay, well, what's the role of the executive branch and the president? But we've gone too far in one direction where we grant very, very broad powers and they do all this garbage. So insofar as they've told them to promulgate regulations and the executive branch can come back and say, okay, I'm looking at the regulations you've promulgated. I don't agree with them. We're cutting these. They can do that, right? But if Congress has set a tax code, like this is the rate you will pay or this is the way you will pay it, the executive branch can't just go in and arbitrarily get rid of that. That requires an act of Congress. So that's the distinguish between these two things. However, if you do go on the Doge.gov leaderboard and you go over to regulations, you will find that they've cut 29.5 thousand words from the Department of Treasury. So, but I have a feeling a lot of that is not going to go into like very, very specific tax code regulations, unless, of course, it's clarifying how things, might be, done in a way that doesn't violate what Congress has already established in law. So I hope that kind of clears that up.
So here's the bad news, though. So we've covered some of the positive stuff that Doge has done.
Cut wasteful spending, cutting regulations. However,
the deficit is not looking great.
Go figure.
So here's an article that I'll just blitz through pretty quickly. So this says each year deficits add to the already enormous national debt, right? There's a difference between deficits and debt.
Yeah.
With interest costs driving further spending growth. The annual deficit is the product of numerous cash flows in and out of the Treasury that reflects past choices by lawmakers. Deviations in a single month might just be one-offs. And then it goes on and it says, but over the course of a year, trends emerge that reveal the state of the nation's fiscal health. So what is the state of the nation's fiscal health currently? Atrocious. Here's what it currently is. Our monthly deficits are currently higher. We're on track right now, 2025, for the deficits to be larger than at any point in the last 5 years, with the exception of literal COVID spending. Yeah. When Jerome Powell's money printer was going burr and Congress was literally passing bills to send trillions of dollars in subsidy payments to everybody through PPP loans, through direct cash checks, through pouring money into COVID recovery plan. I mean, they passed multiple bills during the late Trump and early Biden administration to spend just trillions and trillions of dollars in 2020 and 2021. And here we are in 2025, and the spending is higher than at any point in the last 5 years, with the exception of 2020 and 2021. Yeah. So currently in April, the monthly deficit this is measured in billions of dollars, 1,051 billion.
Yeah.
So that's $100+ billion in 1 month. Yeah. And by the way, that's the month that the federal government collects taxes in. So, yeah, it's not looking great here, is it? And this is after Doge's work, right? Doge has been around since the beginning of the year.
This is the thing we got to distinguish between these two things, right? Like Doge's work, because I've heard people get mad at Doge. Like, why? I'm tired of them identifying it. Why aren't they cutting it? Because they don't have any authority to cut it.
They're not Congress.
They don't have any authority to cut. The best they can do is make the recommendations, and the executive branch can try to sequester the funds, which is to say no more will be spent on this purpose.
And Trump has done that, to give him credit.
Trump has done that. But if it comes down to either pulling it back into the budget or giving it out in whatever it is, right? Congress has to do that. The executive branch can't do it. Doge can't do it. And so the fact that, and this is part of what happened under the whole, Trump was out there and he was advocating for the big, beautiful bill, right? The reconciliation bill, massive, budget. And they are trying to get into like regular order of doing budgets again and not just doing,
continuing resolutions.
Which that is a good thing from a process standpoint. But the reason why Chip Roy and other people had a real problem with this on the committee was it's like, our deficits are still high. We're still raising the debt ceiling. We're still, and part of the argument that the administration is making is like, well, we're getting rid of these regulations. We're getting rid of wasteful spending. We're cutting taxes. We're improving our trade deals with other countries. All that's going to add to additional growth, which will allow us to essentially grow faster than the deficits that we're racking up. And that puts you in a relatively secure position, right? Mm-hmm. To where you can eventually get rid of your deficits because you grow out of them, right? The problem is that what we're seeing right now is, and we've had this comment before, one of my favorite Christian Heinz quotes is, nobody loses a seat for spending too much, but they might lose their head. And unfortunately, this has been something that has been common for a lot of Republican Congresses, because when it comes to cutting spending, somebody's going to get pissed, and it becomes really easy for whoever your political opponents are to come in and say, oh my gosh, you're cutting taxes for the rich, but you're cutting this really important government program for the poorest among us, or whatever else it might be. And what ends up happening is, when everyone's looking toward midterms, which is still like over a year away, but when everyone's looking at midterms, it's like, well, I want to be able to vote to cut taxes, but I also want to be able to say I spent all this money on these things that people think are good.
It goes back to Thomas Sowell's infamous quote where he says, the reason, I'm slightly paraphrasing because it's a somewhat long quote, but it's a beautiful quote. He says something along the lines of, the reason that so many politicians are shameless liars is not just an indictment against them, it's an indictment against us.
Yeah.
Because when the people demand the impossible, only liars can suffice.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, quite frankly, we are entering a world, I think the audience is going to understand why I said this is the doom segment. we are entering a world where it is not, increasingly it is impossible within the current democratic system, and I know that there's going to be people saying, we're a republic, not a democracy. Just hear me out for a second. It's increasingly impossible within our democratic system to stop this, because the incentive structure to promise voters that which is, impossible to sustain over the long term is just far too strong. Go back. Let's go back up to the top here.
Can I say this too? Because there's stuff coming into the comments and whatnot. It's Congress deserves a lot of blame for this, but I want to point something out. Who put him there? Who put him there? Guys, 10 years in a legislature, I saw year after year after year how Republicans in solid red districts would increasingly vote for more spending. Why? My constituents want it. My constituents want this grant. My constituents want this program. My constituents want this thing. And guess what? They keep getting reelected. And anytime someone challenges them, every single organization out there that is dependent upon them to continue to vote for higher spending throws millions of dollars their direction, or tens of thousands, whatever it is. And they end up winning re-election. And in some part, we have seen times where they have upset incumbents through primaries. In fact, there's been some incredible work with organizations like CAA, Citizens Alliance. They've done work in places like Pennsylvania. They've done work in other states where they took out prominent members. Prominent incumbents were taken out, lost the races in primaries because people were paying attention and they were willing to actually make their voices heard. But I got to tell you how frustrating it gets as a legislator where I campaign. Every year I campaigned on, I want to cut government spending. I want to cut government spending. My goal is not to bring back as much money as I can to the district. My goal is to make sure the money doesn't leave the district in the form of taxes that shouldn't exist, or government spending which shouldn't exist. So that's what I'm going after. I'm not going to let them take your money and then go and argue with all of my buddies on how much my district gets back. I'm going to fight that they shouldn't be taken in the first place because government shouldn't be doing the things it's doing. And you know what I found out? That is
You're one of a handful of people.
Popular. That is not very popular. It is super popular when people are saying it generally. But then everybody seems to have that one piece of government spending, that one grant, that one thing that, oh, Nick, but in this case, it's really good. And I would look at him and I would say, look, I'm sorry. I'm not trying to be mean. I'm just telling you, I've stayed consistent on all of this forever. You're really going to vote against the budget? Yes. Why? There's too much spending. You're voting against teachers. You're voting against police. No, I'm not. But I get one vote on the budget. And as long as that budget includes all these other things, I'm voting no. You're not fiscally responsible. Oh, I hear that a lot. I'm a fiscal conservative. And you know what that means? That means they will vote for increased tax increases in order to subsidize government spending. But they'll never be willing to cut the spending in order to make sure you get you don't got to pay for a tax cut. You got to pay for government spending. And I'm just telling people right now, until we have an electorate that is willing to say, no, the government subsidies are not a good idea, even when they are helping me, because it comes at the price of a mentality and a federal government that grows to so much bloat because the trough keeps getting bigger because not everybody's trying to fit their chubby little face in it.
It's even worse than that because we are funding our enemies through this.
Yeah.
How much money do you think Gun Owners of America or NAGR gets in taxpayer subsidies versus how much does Planned Parenthood get?
Yeah. Oh yeah, we give Planned Parenthood $700 million a year between state, local, and federal funds. I once asked a question this year on that, or 1 year I said, "Oh, I got an idea. How about we do a gun safety I want a gun safety program." Yeah, and the way we're going to do this gun safety program is I'm going to take millions of dollars from your constituents and give it to the NRA. And if my Democrat colleagues don't like that, I'm going to accuse you of being against gun safety. And like, do you understand how like bad that overall argument is? And yet, that's what we get for every program, grant, fund, NGO. That's what we get every single time. Oh, you don't want this ideologically entrenched left-wing organization to get millions of dollars, which they inevitably give back to us in the form of campaign contributions? You don't care about health care. Screw you, dude. Like, I'm so tired of that lame ass argument. And I'm so tired of Republicans. And I will see Republicans do this. Well, no, we got to vote for that. Why? Well, it'll look bad if we vote against healthcare. I'm like, dude, if they can intimidate you with that, if they can convince you to give your constituents money to organizations which are advocating against your constituents, you suck as a representative, dude. Period. The end. Get up and make an argument. Well, we'll lose because they control the media. Oh, okay. Well, then just roll over, dude.
Well, that's what we've been doing for like 50-something years now.
Yep.
Conservatives have failed time and time again to stop this, right? This endless march off the cliff fiscally, let alone on any of the social issue stuff, right?
Yeah.
We haven't conserved fiscal conservatism or social conservatism because of everything you just outlined right there. There's always an argument. There's always another reason. There's always another program that needs to be funded. There's always another, oh, well, you know, we can't avoid being dragged through the press on this issue.
Yeah.
We'll fight another day. We'll do this after the midterms.
Yep.
I love that excuse.
Oh, yeah. After the midterms, then we'll do it. After the next election.
We need to protect our majority. Why? What have we done with our majority?
What do you do with it?
I remember at one point we had a super majority in the Virginia House of Delegates here as Republicans. What did we do with it? Oh, we raised taxes.
Yep.
I remember that.
Largest tax increase.
Right before you got elected.
One of the largest tax increases in Virginia history. And it was done with Republicans. 100 members of the House of Delegates. Republicans, I think, had 64 of the seats or 67.
It was 67. They had a super majority.
67 of the seats. They had just taken back the Senate, right? And they had a Republican governor. What do? We
had
raised
a trifecta
taxes.
and we raised
taxes because we were going to fix transportation.
2 years before you got elected.
Yep.
That was part of the reason that we ended up running you.
Yeah.
Was because of that bill. So, point is that I say part of the reason we ended up running, Nick, this slab of meat over here on the other. I hope that you're not offended.
That's the fackle, Mom.
I just said that and I realized I'm like, somebody is going to listen to that.
But it is true. The person who created Nick's actual Facebook page is Christian. It started out as a draft Nick Freitas page.
Yeah,
and then when Nick did finally run, Christian handed it over.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was not intent for the audience. That was not intended to be an insult directed. I think he took that in good faith. But no, I mean, we're on the same page there that it's just incredible. Having worked within the system, you have been in office for 10 years. Yeah. I've worked in politics my entire adult life, longer than that as a volunteer. And we've seen these excuses time and time again.
Well,
and there's one thing that I want to read off before we jump to the next link here, which is really important for people to remember. This sentence right here: the annual deficit is the product of numerous cash flows into and out of the Treasury that reflect past choices by lawmakers.
Yeah.
Past choices by lawmakers. It is not just what's happening this year. We are paying for what happened 30 years ago.
Yeah.
We're paying for what happened 20 years ago. When politicians get elected and they vote for stuff, the actions that they're taking 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago are compounding.
Yeah.
And we're paying for those over time. So you get somebody that gets in there and then they end up voting for all sorts of subsidies, or they end up voting for all sorts of tax hikes, or all sorts of money going to the type of stuff that DOJ is trying to cut.
Yeah.
And 20 years later, they might have already left office by then. But we are now paying for the consequences of their actions that they took in the 90s or their actions that they took in the early 2000s. We're today still paying for everything that the Obama administration and Bush administration and the Republicans and Democrats that ran Congress back then in the early 2000s, we're paying for the consequences of that.
We're paying for the things the FDR administration did like close to 100 years ago.
And guess what? Those actions have consequences because here's something in the news that is not old news. This is very recent. Moody's downgrades United States credit rating, citing growth in government debt. Well, why? I'm surprised we don't have an F- credit rating at this point, because how on earth are we possibly going to pay this off? There's functionally no way to do it. So the article says that, get this, Moody's has cut our sovereign credit rating from AA1 or to AA1 from AAA.
Yeah.
I'm surprised. Again, I'm surprised it's not F- at this point. Yeah. I think it's really funny that we have these credit ratings where it's not just on an A to F scale. It's like AA, AAA, like
double rainbow. There's a reference.
It should be F-. I had somebody once recently ask me, because I geek out about this type of stuff. Like I'm real as just a hobby. I'm really into. I don't do day trading, but I'm really into markets, macroeconomics, all that type of stuff. And we've talked about some of this stuff on the podcast. So naturally, because I spend 5 minutes, suddenly people think I'm some stock market guru. I'm not. I lost $50,000 trying to short DoorDash in 2022. I made $50,000 shorting the treasury market, and then I lost it all trying to short DoorDash. It's funny how I took on Jerome Powell.
Yeah.
I took on the Federal Reserve, the deepest, most liquid treasury market of the world, and I made 50 grand, and then I immediately turned to Zoomer food delivery service, and I lost it all. So easy come, easy go, right? But like, you know how this is. Like, if you're into this type of stuff at all, you just have friend groups that are like, tell me where to throw my life savings. And then you're like, man, things must be really bad if my friend group is coming to me for investment advice. Like, I don't think I'm qualified for even myself, let alone for my friends. But I'm sure that the people who listen have that friend or family member of theirs that are like, well, I don't pay attention to any of this stock market stuff. You tell me what to do. And it's like, ooh, if you ever watch the show Financial Audit, you understand how people end up in that situation. Because anyway, point is that I get people that ask me like, oh, how should I balance my portfolio in terms of like stocks versus bonds? And I'm like, 0% should be in bonds. 0% should be in bonds, because there's an inverse relationship between interest rates and bond prices. Do you think interest rates are going to be going down or up in the future if our credit ratings being downgraded and the debt cycle here is just going through the stratosphere?
Yeah.
Do you think that creditors are going to be asking for lower or higher amounts of interest if it seems like there's no way that the debt's actually going to be paid off?
And can we say something real quick here? The way that interest rates are supposed to work, right, is when you look at investment, and we can get into fractional reserve banking and we can get into the Fed, but let's just put this at a basic level to where everyone understands. The reason why when you borrow money, you get charged interest is because of time preference, right? Like, you need the money right now. You need a certain amount of money right now in order to do something. Maybe it's to, build a house or whatever else it is. And so you get charged interest. And one of the things the person that is loaning you the money takes into account is things like your ability to pay it back, or what sort of things are you actually spending it on? What's your credit history? Like, all these various things. But if they don't actually get some sort of interest for loaning you the money, even if you pay it back, well, then they're losing money due to inflation, right? And so that's what this is. Interest is set up as a time preference mechanism whereby somebody who has money that doesn't need it right now can loan it out to somebody who does need it right now, under the promise that they will make a little bit more money by loaning it out, right? And so that's it, right? That's what we might call, obviously there's, when you look at biblical like usury and stuff like that, the theory is well, that was based around the idea where you have like predatory loaning.
And you basically have like debt slavery. And
Okay. So now that we know that, like that's the concept behind interest rates, time preference and stuff like that. Okay. So how are banks supposed to determine this? Like, what sort of interest rate? Well, typically the more money that's being saved, right? The more money that people are depositing to the bank and then not pulling out to spend means that the bank has more money to loan out. And typically what happens is when they have more money to loan out, they lower the interest rates in order to entice you to invest. The other reason why they do that is because theoretically, if more people are saving, what that means is that they do plan to buy things in the future, but they're not buying them right now. And so this is usually when companies see lower interest rates, it's a signal to the company, not just, hey, this is a good time to invest in, capital projects, or buying something that's going to be really expensive, but but is going to help me for like future business. It's going to help me deliver more of what I provide, or produce more of what I provide. And oh, by the way, it's not just a good time to build this additional capacity because interest rates are low. Interest rates are low because more people are saving, which means they plan to buy more in the future. So that is how prices and interest rates coordinate things within the economy. But when the government just comes in and says, yeah, we're going to lower these interest rates, well, now you're sending perverted signals to the market. You're sending bad signals to the market about what people should be invested in, or how much money is going to be available for future purchasing of consumer goods or services, right? You've manipulated that process through government intervention. And unfortunately, that's what we have a whole lot of. It is government intervening into this process to try to kickstart the economy or slow down the economy. And it's like, guys, the economy is not an engine that we need a mechanic to come in and fix. The economy is human beings engaging in voluntary transactions. And when you allow interest rates to operate the way that they're supposed to, we get a really, really good and efficient balance. We get good equilibrium between where investments should go and how people should spend money, et cetera. But when you screw with it, well, now you send mixed signals, and then people make bad investments. And that's what we have seen. Like, this is called the Austrian theory of the business cycle. It's an aspect of the Austrian theory of the business cycle. By the way, I'm sorry, Andrew asked a question. He goes, if Doge or Republicans fail to make meaningful changes during this administration, is there enough political will behind MAGA to keep pressing the issue, or will it take a crisis to resolve? Andrew, we are gonna answer that. This question is kind of baked into something that we're gonna discuss toward the end. So I didn't want you to think that we had ignored your question. It's just we're gonna get to it a little bit later. Go ahead. Sorry.
So I want to read off a couple paragraphs here from this article that are worth remembering. So this goes on to say that Moody's had been holding out and keeping U.S. sovereign debt at the highest credit rating possible, and it brings the 116-year-old agency into line with its rivals. Standard & Poor's downgraded the U.S. to AA+ from AAA in August 2011. I remember that that debt crisis. And Fitch Ratings also cut the U.S. rating to AA+ from AAA in August 2023. So this has been going on for a while. I remember I was still in high school, but I remember posting on like Facebook about the credit rating downgrade in August 2011. And back then I was like, this is the beginning of, I thought, my 17-year-old self was like, this is the beginning of the end. Little did I know this was going to be dragged out to decades, right? This is the case with the Austrians, right? They're always like, it's over. Yeah. And then like the system has gone on so much longer than the Austrians expected. I mean, the Austrians were thinking the system was going to implode in the 70s when we went off the gold standard.
Yeah.
Like immediately they thought this was the end, right? We're now on, fiat. We're going to be, by the end of the decade, full-blown sovereign debt crisis, and then we're going to force our way back to sound money through probably a second Great Depression.
Yeah.
And that didn't happen, right? And here we are, 50 plus years later, and it still hasn't happened. So like the Austrians have egg on their face because they've been predicting doom and gloom for so long. That doesn't mean that they're wrong. That just means that their timing has been very far off. This has been dragged out far longer than they've anticipated. But look, the question that we have to ask is, why is the debt still exploding? Why are we getting things like credit downgrades if Doge is doing all this incredible work that we pointed out, right? I mean, again, hundreds of thousands of regulations cut, hundreds of billions cut, and yet the debt is higher than it ever has been. The deficit is growing faster than at any point since 2020 was a bit of an anomaly, right? But I mean, look, we're on a trajectory where within probably 5 to 10 years, the deficits will be larger than they were even in 2020.
Yeah.
And so what's going on there? Well, part of the problem is that Congress isn't doing anything. So here's a headline. Trump signs fewer laws in the first 100 days as he pushes to expand executive power. Trump has largely bypassed, I love the framing of this. Trump has largely bypassed the Republican-led Congress to pursue an agenda at the outset of a new administration, a break from his first term. No, Trump is having to do everything through executive order because Congress hasn't sent him anything for him to sign. He has signed something like 5 bills since he's taken office, which is the fewest amount of bills of any president in the past 100 years. What's he supposed to do?
I've sat here before and I've tried to figure out, because again, one of the things that we try to do on here is we try to steel man arguments. We try to not just go to the really easy, oh, they're all idiots, they're all morons, they all suck. It's like, okay, usually, I'm not saying that what they're doing doesn't suck. I'm just saying that
we're definitely in agreement. That it
usually there's more of an explanation than you just suck, right? There's the only thing I can figure is that it's 2 components. One, Speaker Johnson doesn't feel like he has a great deal of power over the speakership by the virtue of how he was put in there and the fact that certain rules were changed in order to make it easier to vacate the chair.
And we have a very small majority.
And because we have a small majority, that means a relatively small number of Republicans can work with Democrats to theoretically throw out a speaker. And the Democrats are happy to, they're happy to play ball because it puts Republicans in disarray and it upsets our agenda. By the same token, what speakers have done in the past when that's been a problem is they've made deals with Democrats. And so there's this careful balancing act between wanting to be able to hold your speakers accountable and not wanting to put them in a position where they can actually, they can maintain the speakership because they've got to deal with Democrats and enough Republicans to keep them in power. And so that's one theory right here, is that Speaker Johnson finds himself in a situation where he doesn't feel like he can kind of use the whip hand in order to get people in line, right? That's one theory. Another theory is, with midterms coming up, the Republicans that are in the districts which are the most like in trouble, or I shouldn't even say in trouble, just easiest to contest, right? The purple districts. They don't want to do anything with respect to cutting spending because inevitably that's going to make some people mad. And as mad as a voter may be about the general condition of the country, the voter is very laser focused on the particular program, grant, subsidy that they receive, are always more motivated. And so they're doing a political calculation in their head. They're saying, I can get away with the tax cut. I can't get away with the spending cut. Otherwise I lose my seat. You're going to get a Democrat, and a Democrat won't give you your tax cut and it'll increase the spending. So what do you want, right? And everything I just said right now is logical. The problem is that it isn't good enough. And this kind of goes into Andrew's, part of Andrew's question of, okay, so how do you get it to be good enough, right? Like, how do you get to that point where Americans are ready to look at some of these programs, some of these, these spending mechanisms that have become sacred cows, and they're willing to say, don't care anymore. It's so bad, it's just got to go away. And one of the things that I think is going to be important as we go forward here is I think members of Congress need to understand that they have an alternative. Because right now it's like, okay, I can cut taxes, but I can't cut spending. Why can't you cut spending? Well, it's because people want they want the funds, they want the grants, they want the subsidies. Okay, but 3 of the biggest things that are leading to our deficits are Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. There are any number of things that you can do. Well, okay, but I can make an argument for why the military is a legitimate function of the federal government on Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. There's zero justification for Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare under Article 1, Section 8.
Granted, I'm just pointing out that it's a huge,
I know, but it's minuscule compared to Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. What I would love to see, is somebody in a deep red district with the guts to actually offer an alternative, to actually go out there and say, do you realize that you're all getting ripped off? And I don't mean just bad government spending. Do you actually realize that if we were allow you to take the same amount of money that we have taken from you in Social Security, and we actually just let you put it into, let's say, one of 5 index funds that are incredibly safe, you wouldn't be retiring with a, however many couple $1,000 check from the government a month, you'd be retiring as a millionaire. You'd be retiring as a millionaire. But nope, we're going to force you to do this, and you're going to continue to be scared into doing it. There needs to be someone in Congress that when we look at some of these spending programs, what they do is they don't just point to it's bad. They don't just point to we don't have enough money, because the response to that will always be, well, stop giving money to foreign governments. Guys, good idea. You should stop giving all this money to foreign governments. It is a drop in the bucket compared to the other spending bills. It's a drop in the bucket. It's like saying, well, gosh, I can still have this $1 trillion program if you would just stop giving $1 billion to that guy. That math doesn't math.
This is also why DOGE is not enough, because DOGE is touching discretionary spending, not mandatory spending. Yeah. But we're getting to a point where mandatory spending plus interest, which is also mandatory spending unless we default, right? We're getting to a point where mandatory spending plus interest is basically, that's effectively 100% of federal tax revenues right then and there.
Yeah.
So I've got the debt clock pulled up for us to look at. The numbers here are not pretty.
Yeah.
Medicare and Medicaid, 1.6 trillion, almost 1.7 trillion. Social Security, 1.5 trillion. Defense, 900 billion. It'll eventually be $1 trillion. Interest on the debt, $1 trillion, more than the Pentagon. We're spending on just paying the interest on treasury bonds.
Yeah. If you look at the primary reason why the federal government was actually formed, one of the primary reasons was defense. National defense was supposed to be the purview of the federal government. It was going to put us in a better position to be able to defend the individual states.
And historically, defense spending, military spending, for the vast majority of human history, was the overwhelming majority of all government revenues in every country around the world.
Yeah.
Until really the late second half of the 20th century. But when you combine Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, the Pentagon, and interest, all of that combined, so there's $1 trillion right there, that's 900 billion right there, that's 1.5 trillion right there, and that's almost 1.7 trillion right there. Those 5 things combined is more than the total federal tax revenue of 5.1 trillion.
Yeah.
So you could eliminate everything else in the entire federal budget that is not the Pentagon and entitlement programs. Yeah. Everything else, every cent, which means that DOGE could eliminate 100% of discretionary spending outside the Pentagon.
Yeah.
And yet we would not balance the budget.
Mm-hmm.
So that tells you right there that there's, getting back to the question of like, well, is DOGE going to fail, or has it failed? Well, the question is not, is it going to fail? It can't succeed. It can't balance the budget in of itself. What's necessary is for Congress to act, but Congress is not acting. As we just talked about, they've only sent Trump 5 bills. And so now we've got to, okay, well, we have the big, beautiful bill, right? I love how they called it that, right? We have this giant reconciliation bill, this quasi budget package. Well, they're struggling to get this thing passed. They made an attempt in the House Budget Committee and it failed.
Yeah, and they did have, and I will say this too, they did actually go after some of they went after Medicaid. They went after certain aspects with Medicaid, which, by the way, had to happen. Yeah, especially when you understand how much of your Medicaid spending is going to able-bodied adults who don't work. Like at some point, let me get this straight. I have to work to pay for my health care. And now I have to work to pay for your health care, and you don't got to work at all. I'm not talking about people with suffering from disabilities who cannot work. I'm talking about we've incentivized a healthcare system that encourages people not to work and yet still get medical benefits. Like, did we think that was sustainable indefinitely? And not only that, but I remember real well having this debate in the Virginia House of Delegates with, by the way, a Republican majority House. And we had always voted against Medicaid expansion in Virginia because we knew it was going to break our budget if we did it. We knew we wouldn't be able to afford it. And we got told we are leaving all these federal dollars on the table. And some of us stood up and said, those federal dollars are in many cases debt or inflationary spending. They're not real. And eventually what's going to happen is when the federal government is forced to start addressing their own debt and spending problems, what they're going to do is pull back funding that they're currently giving to the states, and they're going to tell the states to handle it. And you know what I got told You want to know what I got told by local officials? You want to know what I got told by Republicans? Nick, you're just mean. People need this. I'm like, oh, okay, well, I'm going to tell you right now, this is what's going to happen. And this is going to eat it. Right now, our number one budget, our top budget item used to be education in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Now it's healthcare. It's healthcare spending. But no. I was just mean. And I watched as a Republican speaker, and I watched as Republicans from the most conservative districts in the Commonwealth of Virginia all stood up and say, well, you know what? Our constituents really need this. And we all said, you are going to get them hooked on a program which is not sustainable. You think that's what your constituents need? But it was popular. We're leaving all this money on the table. Well, guess what?
The money dried up.
The bills come time to pay.
Money hasn't dried up yet.
Well, bills come. Well, but they are doing cuts to that, and those cuts are going to disproportionately impact states at some point because they have to. Right? It's not anyone's being mean. This was just always the reality that was going to take place. And nothing is more frustrating. Nothing is more frustrating than sitting as I'm listening to members of, local governments, right? Local school boards, local,
board of supervisors.
Social workers and whatnot going, Delegate Freitas, we lost funding for this, and this. Do you think we'll be able to get that back in the state budget? No. Well, why not? Because we don't have it. Well, can we lean on the federal government to do what? Print more money? And then you're looking at these people going, I remember when you were all advocating for the expansion of these programs. And I remember when I said this would happen. And I remember when I was told I was mean. Okay. How's it working out?
Well,
now is anybody at this table going to be like, gosh, you know what? You don't even got to say you were right. But is anybody going to say, okay, gosh, yeah, that's true. How do we navigate through this? No, it's always just spend more. Well, how the hell do we spend more?
Isn't there like twice as many people or 3 times as many people on it than they originally thought would be on it?
They told us originally it was going to be 325,000 people on it, and don't worry, we're going to do a work requirement. And we looked at them and we said, the work requirement's going to be found to be unconstitutional immediately and gotten rid of it, and you're going to have a lot more people on. No, that won't happen. You're just fear-mongering. I think it was within a year. Instead of 330,000, it was 425, and the work requirement was deemed unconstitutional and not able to be applied. So what did you have? I actually had a mother call me up practically in tears going, I used to be able to get my severely disabled daughter an appointment for a doctor, and now I can't because, and in her case, it was because I have a relative who doesn't have any significant disabilities. They just don't work. And they don't work and they don't take care of themselves. And now all of a sudden they can get all the appointments they need. And I can't get an appointment for my daughter for months. So the very reason the way the program was set up initially, right, we're going to help the people that just absolutely desperate need help, has now been expanded to include a bunch of people that quite frankly need to work.
Mm-hmm. And as of February 2025, that number grew to 595,000.
So now it's the largest item, and I got the schools coming to me going, Nick, we just need more money. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, it's not there. What do you want me to push the compassion button? Is there a compassion button somewhere where dollars spit out? No, there isn't. Because it turns out the compassionate thing to do is to actually be truly fiscally responsible and recognize that there are certain things, certain functions the government should not do because they don't do them well. But that would have been mean. Okay, so now you find yourself in a situation like this where you've actually taken on far more commitments than you can actually fund. Now, what do you do about it?
This is basically why I've kind of given up on fiscal conservatism, going back to that phrase. Not because I've become fiscally progressive, right? But because I see it like people, what the problem is that people can't do math. And those people vote.
That's because math is racist, vote. Christian. How dare you? Yeah. Math is a tool of the patriarchy.
It's people can't do math. They vote, and then they elect people who either can't or willingly choose not to do math. Well, one or the other.
So I'm gonna push back on one thing real quick. No, actually, everybody is doing a form of math. Everybody's doing a form of math. The voters' math is, well, I'm electing you to fix this, and you've told me you can do it, so I guess you can do it. The politician is engaging in political math.
How do I win?
This many promises versus what can actually be delivered versus who I can blame equals how many votes I get. And I get more votes the more stuff I promise, regardless of whether or not it can be like feasibly delivered upon. Right. And then when it doesn't work, that's fine. I just blame somebody else. And I say it's all because they're evil, mean, and cruel. It's that unnice guy, Nick, over there that refuses to vote for your health care. Right. There we go.
And then linking yourself to the federal government. So here's a fun fact, you guys. Roughly 2 million Virginians enrolled in Medicaid due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and because they lost their jobs, right? So all of a sudden now they're like, oh yeah, 300 and some odd million or 300,000 people are going to be on this. And then it balloons to 2 million during COVID. Now since 480,000 of them have removed themselves because, they have jobs now again because the federal government's not shutting them down. But this is like, it's outrageous. Once you open it up like that, their estimates mean nothing. Nothing. If the private sector were to do something like that and miss their targets by that amount of money, people would be getting fired.
Yeah.
People would be going to court and be getting sued. People might even be in jail.
Let me point this out too. Because this recently came out, and it was, what was it? It was how Congress can fix the flawed financing structure for Medicaid expansion and reprioritize the truly needy. All right, so this is a group that says, no, we want the federal government to do all this stuff. We just want them to fix some of the mistakes. Let me tell you, let me give you this little quote right here. Currently states receive $9 in federal dollars. So $9 from the feds for every $1 they spend on Medicaid for able-bodied adults, but they receive $1.33 for every $1 spent on the disabled, pregnant moms, kids, and the elderly in nursing homes. So this has been set up in such a way where you get a ton more money from the feds if you take on people who are not disabled, right, than it is if you actually take on people that are disabled. So let me ask you something. If you're from the position of the government, if you're someone that wants to expand the government, if you're someone that wants to expand what government's doing and how it's doing and what it's controlling, and you get $9 for every $1 you spend for someone that's not disabled, but only $1.33 for every dollar you spend for someone who is disabled, what have you actually designed the program to do? You've designed the program to expand, to include, you've decided to prioritize people who are not disabled. Now, people will look at that and be like, well, that's ridiculous, Nick. Well, that wasn't intended. Yes, it was. Because the more people that are absolutely dependent upon a program like this, the more they will show up and vehemently fight to protect it. Doesn't matter that it's not solvent. Doesn't matter that this is not long-term sustainable. Right? It's become something that they feel like they pay for, and now they get a benefit from. And after all, they deserve this. They're entitled to it. If anybody tries to take it away from them, it feels like they're being robbed. And that is the easiest thing in the world for politicians to be able to campaign on. How much easier is it for my opponent to get up on a stage and being like, he wants to steal your health care, versus me going, okay, let me go ahead and explain like the theory here between Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, not to mention the fact that you have, again, concentrated benefits versus dispersed costs. Like if I actually want to do a good job explaining what's going on here and why it's a problem, I've actually got to dig into the weeds a little bit.
Yeah, and that's not what people want. They want to hear the talking points they want to hear. They want to be told what they want to hear. That's why, who was it that said, it's no wonder that politicians are such shameless liars?
Was
that Thomas Sowell?
I've got another quote here. I love this so much. Nick Land wrote several years ago.
We knew we were going here eventually.
When he wrote his essay, The Dark Enlightenment, he has an introduction at the start where he says that in August 2011, which was when the credit rating was first downgraded, the federal credit rating, if you remember that.
Yeah.
In August 2011, Michael Lind posted a Democratic repost at Salon, digging up some impressively malodorous dirt, concluding, quote, "The dread of democracy by libertarians and classical liberals is justified. Libertarianism really is incompatible with democracy. Most libertarians have made it clear which of the two they prefer. The only question that remains to be settled is why anyone should pay attention to libertarians." Spoiler alert, Michael Lind is a leftist, right?
Yeah.
He's But Land continues and he says, Lind and the neo-reactionaries, they're not in agreement, seem to be in a broad, well, okay, they're not in agreement in terms of what they believe in, but they are, he's saying they are in agreement in this, seem to be in broad agreement that democracy is not only or even a system, but rather a vector with an unmistakable direction. Democracy and progressive democracy are synonyms, or synonymous and indistinguishable from the expansion of the state. Whilst extreme right-wing governments have, on rare occasions, momentarily arrested this progress, its reversal lies beyond the bounds of democratic possibility. Since winning elections is overwhelmingly a matter of vote buying, and society's informational organs, education and media, are no more resistant to bribery than the electorate, a thrifty politician is simply an incompetent politician. And the democratic variant of Darwinism quickly eliminates such misfits from the gene pool.
Oh my gosh, not wrong.
You get why I'm a fan of some of Nick Land's writings. He concludes, I'll read the last couple sentences here. This is a reality the left applauds, the establishment right grumblingly accepts, and the libertarian right has ineffectively rallied against. Increasingly, however, libertarians have ceased to care whether anyone is paying them attention, and they have been looking for something else entirely, an exit. So this is where you get libertarians that say, well, let's all just move to New Hampshire and trade in Bitcoin and gold, right? This is actually why Bitcoin was created, was a way to financially exit basically from that system. It's to check out from the fiat system, basically. Mm-hmm. This is why you get libertarians that are like, I'm going to go off to the woods in Idaho and just hoard guns and gold and land and just wait for civilization to implode, basically. Yeah. Because they've given up in a sense that they're just checking out. They're looking for the exit, basically.
Well, I've made this argument before when I talk to audiences and I say, okay, we all understand the problem with state-run media, right? Well, yeah. If you have a media that's run by the state, it's just going to regurgitate the state's talking points and it's not going to hold them to account. I said, okay, cool. Now do it with state-run education.
Yep.
Oh, well, that's different. Not really. Not really.
No, especially when you look at some of the certifications they are mandated to go through.
Yeah.
Even if the teachers themselves don't believe in some of these things and don't agree with it, they're still mandated to go through this training.
I was at a high school graduation not long ago. I won't say which one, but I was at a high school graduation not long ago, and I just learned so much from the speech by this young white girl about the plight of the evils of men and the plight of Black America and how we don't do enough to save the planet and temperatures are higher. And I'm sitting here listening, going like, okay, yeah, that's, I'm sure you had relatively little pushback on any of this throughout your education, despite the fact that all of the data that you would need to readily push back against all of it is available. It's not hard to find. And yet here we are, right? Here we are. And this was not in San Francisco, right? This graduation was not in San Francisco.
It's in rural central Virginia.
It was I didn't say that. I said it was a high school graduation I attended. It was definitely in a place that voted for Trump by over 60%.
Yeah, it's always a liberal white girl. It's always a liberal white girl doing this crap. It's like,
well, you remember the line from 1984.
They hate themselves so much that they need to like project to everybody that I'm not part of this oppressive group
there's a line in 1984 where Orwell says, when he's describing the society, he's like, it was always the women, and the young women in particular, that were the most bigoted adherents of the party slogans.
Yep.
like that.
Well, it's funny. I can't remember who it was. Oh man, I cited him once before, but he sent out a tweet and he showed that it was something like 53% of all of the DEI jobs were white women. Right, they were liberal white women.
It's make work for
liberal white women, right? Like all these these DEI posts within these HR departments and everything else. I wish I could find it. I wish I could remember. I apologize, but it was like 50. I think it was 53%. Don't quote me on that. It was like liberal white. Shouldn't say liberal. White women were filling these positions. It's like, oh, okay.
Yep. What's really funny is when you've got DEI liberal white woman running for governor against a Black woman who was an immigrant, and she's still like, ooh, racism, blah blah blah, and it's like, hey, if you really believed what you are saying, maybe you would make way for the Black woman. But no, of course they wouldn't do that.
No, Abigail Spanberger.
It doesn't apply to them.
Abigail Spanberger will love to lecture all of us on how we need to sit down, shut up, and listen to Black women. She's currently running against the woman that has the best potential to be the first black female governor in U.S. history. Right? But nope. She's gonna. Nope. We need the liberal white woman.
It's worth noting that if Winsome Sears wins, she's not going to be celebrated, or you know what I mean. It's not going to be like a Rosa Parks type situation where oh yeah, we're going to put her in the history books and build statues and stuff. Like, they only reserve that for leftists.
Yeah, look at Supreme Court Ruth Bader Ginsburg and how they celebrated her as if she was the first woman on the Supreme Court, and she wasn't.
No.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. So last thing that I want to play briefly before we get into the closing about. Hopefully we'll circle back around once we're done with this, and because we've been dooming for a while.
Yeah.
Is a clip from my favorite economist, Lynn Alden, a few days ago. She was basically giving some projections about, well, okay, what's the fiscal state of things? And somebody asked her, they're like, okay, is Doge going to do anything? Are we going to move towards a balanced budget? And I'm only going to play a little bit of this, obviously, because this was a multi-hour long podcast. But I'm just happy because this is going to be my first opportunity to like introduce her to our audience. And I'm definitely a huge fan of the work that she does. So I want to get her take on this, and then we'll get to basically the closing here of, okay, it sounds like we're doomed. Are we actually doomed? What's the work that Doge is doing? Is it going to be relevant, and what are we going to do going forward? So I want your reaction to this.
I keep pointing out that attempts at meaningfully closing the fiscal deficit in the U.S. Have a very high chance of failing. There's a number of reasons for that. One is they don't want to cut any of the major things. So they don't want to cut Social Security, they don't want to cut the military, and they don't want to cut Medicare. And they can't really cut interest expense, and they don't want to cut veterans benefits. And those things together are like over 80% of the spending. And so it's kind of a third rail to cut any of the things that would need to be cut if you want to do that. And then two, the U.S. is more financialized than most other economies. And so, for example, if let's say we just do a big tax hike, which is kind of what the tariffs are, as that kind of takes effect over months and quarters, that can impair the stock market, for example. It doesn't even have to go down. If the stock market just kind of goes sideways for a few years or even a couple years, that can actually start to impact tax receipts on capital gains, on income, on especially on executive compensation. Executives, they get paid in stock and stock options, and those stocks are no longer going up, so they have less tax to pay. And so we get income from one source, but then it helps diminish our income from another source, and we find that our deficits are still big. And so it's quite a Gordian knot to untie, which is why I don't really expect it to be untied within, let's say, the next decade.
What are your thoughts on that? I mean, her argument is basically that, look, the type of things that would meaningfully shift the debt are 80% of federal spending that are political third rails that no politician wants to touch.
They're politically untouchable.
The second point that she brings up, which I think she's kind of she's not the only one, but she's kind of unique in this broader conversation, is, look, we're in a hyper financialized country right now. Everything is basically just Wall Street and Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
It's not the real economy. It's shifting numbers on pieces of paper. And when the federal government is drawing a huge amount of its tax revenues from that hyper-financialization, anything that might disrupt that, even if that's a bad thing, anything that might disrupt that would simply result in lower revenues from that. And so you might want to raise taxes from a better source. For example, say whatever you want about tariffs. She pointed out that it's a tax, but for most of American history, the federal government was drawing almost all of their revenue from tariffs, right? So if you wanted to go back to that type of system, well, you can't really tackle the deficit from tariffs, because what you're probably going to do is result in lower stock prices or lower executive compensation. And if that happens, then the federal government is drawing fewer tax dollars from that. So what you're really doing is kind of, swimming in place. You're not really moving the ball down the field. So if you can't cut spending, and if you can't really raise taxes effectively without disrupting that hyper-financialization, then what are you left with? This is why she says, I don't really see a mechanism for us to address this over the next 10 years. I know that I just unfortunately spent 3 minutes just reiterating what we just played, but Like, do you get her argument there, and do you agree or disagree, and how do you see that playing into Doge?
Yeah, so here's the only thing that I've ever had. So again, what Lyn Alden is saying is, I believe, correct. That doesn't mean it's inevitable. It just means it is the most probable outcome because FDR, let me explain it this way. You look at something like Social Security. If you wanted to do something like Social Security, you could do something like Singapore that would give you a far better return on investment, would be far better for your economy, and far less likely for the government to be able to rip it off and then steal things. And yet, if you were to even say, no, I don't want to get rid of Social Security, I just want to move it to a plan that's actually sustainable and it actually has produced better results in another country, could you convince enough people to actually do that? I would say with our current education system, probably not. Now, we are living in a time where when you consider the boomer generation is now steadily losing overall power. They still have a great deal of power within our political process. And they still are demographically the most committed to kind of maintaining the status quo. But there is this kind of narrow hope to being able to actually raise a different generation that looks at these things differently. My question is I think Lyn's absolutely correct, provided that certain things remain consistent. There is no question that with the current Congress, they are probably never going to make significant cuts to Social Security, Medicaid, or Medicare, or at least the kinds that would be necessary to actually, start to address these fundamental systemic problems. So how do you get to that? Well, the way that you get to that is you actually raise an electorate that views these things differently and doesn't have the same commitment to things. Like, I'm 46. I was raised to have this commitment. Excuse me, I'm 40. I'm about to turn 46. I was raised
You're
to have
45, babe, until August.
I was raised to have this commitment to Social Security, right? Medicaid, Medicare. When I was young, I remember thinking of these things as, oh, these are good things that the government does to help people in need. As I started to study more and learn more, I realized that, well, no, these are horribly run and incredibly inefficient programs. They're not legitimate functions of government. They're going to cause us massive problems within our... Okay, but how many people ever go through that process of learning that? And why was I in a position to be willing to learn it? Because I went to public school for a while, and then I went to a really, really tiny Christian school that wasn't necessarily... it was conservative in its values, but it's not like we were reading Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell or anything like that, right? When you looked at our textbooks, it was all about how FDR saved us from the Great Depression, right? I was learning the same things that anybody would at a public school would about certain eras within our history that got us to this point. So Lyn's correct. Current Congress is not going to touch this. Doge can identify out there. President Trump is worried about these things, because it is such a sacred cow within the electorate. So can you fix this right now within this administrative term? No. What could you do? Well, you can do what they're doing right now, which is good, which is going after all the stuff that is so blatantly wasteful and, ideologically driven that people are willing to do two things. They're willing to accept certain cuts now. They're willing to accept a level of cuts they probably wouldn't have been willing to accept before, because now they're pissed. One of the things that Doge did that was so important was everybody had this kind of feeling that something was off. Doge showed the receipts. So now I got something I can look at. And if you tell me that's not really happening, I don't trust you anymore. The other thing that's unique about the time that we're living in right now is 2020. Because of what happened during COVID, because every single expert, talking head, government agency, media platform told me to ignore what I was seeing with my eyes and just blindly trust and follow whatever they told me, whatever they mandated, whatever they did. And if you didn't, we'll deplatform you, we'll fire you. You had people, the majority of Democrats or a plurality of Democrats were saying, well, of course you should take someone's kids away if they won't get the COVID vaccine. And so something broke there. There was a certain level of trust in institutions which had made it through everything, and it didn't make it through COVID. COVID was the thing that taught a lot of people to wake up and say, you know what? You don't get to tell me it's a conspiracy theory because you find it inconvenient. You can either show me the receipts or show me the facts or shut up. But you don't get to embarrass me anymore when I question you about a vaccine. You don't get to tell me to sit down and shut up anymore when I question you about a government program, or when I question you about a war that the government's going to fight, or about what's being taught in my kid's school. You don't get to do that anymore. The question is how do we transfer that same healthy skepticism for all these other things into the areas where it really needs to exist? And I think I believe that's going to start with more people talking about those sacred cows for what they really are, which are freaking traps, and more people being educated outside of a government system that raises kids to believe that these things are sacred and cannot be touched. They're entitlements. And one of the things FDR got so right about Social Security, because initially it was, well, we're just going to do this for the people that are truly poor and truly need it and they don't have any family, they don't have any other civic organizations they can rely upon. This is going to be the ultimate safety net. And FDR was adamant, nope, everyone's going to pay into it and everyone's going to get a benefit from it. Because if you do that, they will fight like hell to keep it. They stole your money, made you put it into one of the worst retirement benefits that have ever been conceived by the mind of man, that would be illegal if a private sector company attempted to do the same thing, and you will fight for it tooth and nail. Why? Well, because by God, you had to pay for it. I mean, think about how pernicious that is. Think about what a pernicious piece of psychology that is. I'm forcing you to do something that's not good. But because I made you pay for it and because you get something, you're going to now fight for it to the death? Yeah, that is what has been proven. FDR was right. He understood something about human nature and he exploited it. And now I'm going to have a ton of people coming on when we publish this. It's going to be something, you just want grandpa and grandma to die. I got news for you. When you look across the board, that generation's doing pretty good with respect to wealth creation. I'll tell you who's not doing very good. It's the people trying to get a start off in life that are getting buried under a mountain of inflation, regulations, taxes that make it impossible for them to do the things, or make it incredibly difficult for them to do the things they want, so you can continue to collect something that, oh, by the way, the money you paid into it, that's already been spent.
Yeah.
But here we are. So I hope that, again, what Len said is true about the current makeup, but I do believe a shift is possible. I'm not even going to say it's coming, because the shift went to a certain point, and now I feel like it's I don't know. I don't know where it's going to go next. I know that the woke don't win, right? They can't ultimately. Their ideology, but that is why you're starting to see more and more people on the left shift their argument away from woke and back over to economic class distinctions.
Yeah, the left is trying to play the economic populist card, but the problem is, I don't think people are going to buy it because two reasons.
No.
One, they can't ignore the woke entirely. Like the voters realize that, okay, you're talking about economic populism, but you're only talking about that because you think it polls better. I know that you want to trans the kids, right? I know that you want open borders. I know that you want to deconstruct whiteness and have DEI and ESG scores and all of that type of stuff. So that's the first issue. Is I don't think the left can fully escape woke. The second issue is that you have massive mismanagement of blue states and blue cities. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, Democrats own that. They own what has happened to Illinois, to California, to New York.
I don't think that's true. I think it's true that they should own it. I think that's part of the reason that Trump won, is because they applied the California model to the country during Biden's term in office. And the American public didn't want to go through Californication at a nationwide scale. So I think that's a huge reason that Trump won in 2020. No, I think you're right. I think it's the primary reason he won the popular vote. But
there were a lot of people in California that didn't want, even though there weren't a majority, right?
But the other thing I look at is with these cities, like, do you have any hope that we're going to get a Republican governor in California or Illinois anytime soon?
No.
So this is when we call it like the mind virus is not just a woke mind virus. It is a leftist mind virus. And leftism picks up whatever shiny toy they think is going to help it accumulate power at any given moment. It's why AOC doesn't have pronouns in her bio anymore. I mean, she was one of the people out there running around. This was so important.
It's why Keir Starmer is now sounding like a hawk on immigration.
Yeah. I mean, you're listening to Keir Starmer now versus Keir Starmer now would have been a horrible racist bigot to Keir Starmer 40 seconds ago. But now we're supposed to believe that, oh, yeah, no, he's really serious about this. No, what he realizes, this doesn't help us win elections anymore. Reform just kicked the living piss out of us in the councilors' elections.
And the voters we're importing don't even vote for us anymore anyway.
Yeah.
They're voting for their own independent candidates.
And so this is, again, the issue is never the issue. The issue is always about power and the concentration of it. And the left will pick up whatever little totem they need at any given time in order to advocate for it. And so that's why Darth Amalgamation said, question, how do you raise a good electorate before the country is destroyed? This is the part where I am eternally optimistic. Right? Because you can do a lot in
Nick
one
and I
generation.
would give very different answers to that question.
You can do a lot in one generation. You really can. But it has to be a concerted effort. You have to actually be intentional about these things. So many people think, well, I'm going to vote, or I'm going to be more active, or I'm going to read more about it, or I'm going to be, slightly more involved in my kids' lives.
I'm going to comment more on Facebook.
Yeah, that's not doing it. That's not being intentional about it. Like I said, I have 3 kids. All of them graduated from high school. Right? Like one of them's a hardcore theater kid, super conservative, right? Super grounded in her faith, married already. Why? Well, because there's, and look, don't get me wrong. There are some kids that grow up and they were wonderfully raised and yet they still go off the deep end. But the one thing that I will keep going back to over and over and over again is, who are the biggest influences on your children as they are growing up? I don't worry right now, right? I don't worry how my kids are going to vote. I don't worry how my kids see the world or the worldview. And it's not because I hid them from all of this stuff. I guarantee you, my kids had more exposure to competing worldviews than your average kid that is sitting in a public school classroom that is pretty much being taught one side of the political spectrum, one way to think about things, and then everything else is caricatured as nothing more than evil.
Yeah.
Right. When my kids came to talk to me and I heard them regurgitate something that I knew they heard me say, I'd stop them right there and be like, why do you think that? And we'd have a discussion about it. We would talk about, I'd make them defend their position.
Yeah. Don't just say it because we said it. I want to know that you actually know why. You actually understand what's behind that. Not just, oh, here's the prescription, now take it.
So what?
Well, okay, but let me finish part of this too. I think the other thing too, when I say we need to be intentional about it, is that intentionally creating a generation that is willing to question all the things that the recent previous generations have now adopted as sacred cows that you cannot touch, which has made those positions politically unassailable. Okay, what do you have to do? Okay, well, you have to be willing to question those things. You have to be willing to raise kids that question those things, which means you can't accept the same level of influence from the various institutions that have been ideologically captured and are pushing this agenda.
You cannot compete with the Department of Education for the raising of your children.
No.
They will win.
Yeah, it's not reasonable. It's not reasonable to give other things, whether it be the internet, whether it be government schools, it's not reasonable to give those places. If you've given Hollywood and the public school system, which is designed to advocate for the public school system and for the government systems which advocate for it, right? If you give them the vast majority of time and influence with your children, then that's who they're influenced by. They're not raised by you. You provide food, clothing, and shelter at best. But they're raised by them. And they've been taught to believe that they're the experts. It's not you. You're just my parent. And
that's a whole topic that one day we should probably cover, is the issue of expertise and how that's actually been used as a mask or a cover for really a political agenda, right? But it's, well, I'm not actually pushing a political agenda. I'm a neutral expert, but it just so happens that all the neutral experts are pushing progressivism.
Yeah. Well, and Loyal to Law brought up too the whole concept of intentional community. Like, one of the reasons why we have our community on Circle is this idea of, like-minded people. That's people with a similar worldview, but they still disagree on individual topics. We disagree. Like, the three of us sit here and disagree on things, but similar worldviews, same basic commitments to objective truth, objective morality, etc. Right? And so it's about seeking out more communities that actually believe in those things. Because here's the other thing that you notice. And James Lindsay, as much as people want to like trash James Lindsay right now, he did one of the best jobs of articulating the way the left infiltrate a particular organization, take it over, and then kick you out. Right? Because our worldview generally says, okay, yeah, you can have a seat at the table and your views can also be expressed and we can debate them. They don't believe that about your views. And yet we continually send our kids off to organizations that adopt that sort of worldview and philosophy. And then when we're shocked, when we get excluded. And so part of this is about just being intentional about what you do with your family, your friend group. It's becoming more and more intentional about where you live. I will tell you this much. We had a whole episode on this. When do you fight for your state? And when do you move and fight for a state that's actually willing to fight? Because states do get to a point where they've thrown in the towel. And that's usually a combination of a couple of things. You have Republicans that are not willing to actually fight and stand up and be leaders for values. You have a very, very robust and active left-wing voting demographic. And then you have a bunch of people that are just complacent. They don't care. It's all the same. What really matters? And they don't fight for anything either. And then what ends up happening over a relatively short period of time, because again, the nature of progressive politics is when they have power, they wield it to as drastic effect as they can possibly get away with. And get away with for them is not necessarily the next election cycle. They're willing to take a loss on the next election cycle if they know they can actually get in policies which will outlive them. They are willing to do it. That say what you want, that is to some degree the courage of your convictions. And we lack that within Republican politicians because they buy into this argument that, well, you can't do anything if you can't get elected. Well, I got news for you. If the only thing you do when you are elected is compromise, then you don't deserve to be there.
We chase public opinion and they make public opinion.
Yes.
And then we wonder why over a 30, 40-year long period, things end up being the way that they are. The last thing on all of this that I want to say, and you brought up something that was quite relevant here, is that, look, on the question of whether or not Doge is going to be successful, I know that there's plenty of doomsayers out there. To a degree, I'm one of those doomsayers. But it's worth noting success can be defined in a couple different ways. Is Doge going to balance the budget and save us from a sovereign debt crisis? No, it's not. I agree with Lyn Alden. I agree with other people outside of just Lyn Alden that think that, look, nothing is going to stop this. This is an avalanche that's going to come. And as Brent Johnson pointed out, who we've covered his work before on this podcast with his dollar milkshake theory, it's not really just the U.S., it's actually the entire developed world is going to go through a sovereign debt crisis. In many respects, the U.S. might be the last man standing. They might actually get out of this better off than other countries. I don't really think that Doge is going to prevent that from happening. But I do think that Doge can, if it's done properly, defund large aspects of the left's institutional capture, where they've used our federal tax dollars. It's not really the government's, it's our money. They've used our money to fund themselves and push their ideological agenda through institutions that they've ideologically hijacked using the Gramscian Duce model of the long march through the institutions. Mm-hmm. If we shut off the flow of funding to those ideologically hijacked institutions within media, within academia, then when the sovereign debt crisis does unfold, as I would argue it currently is, or at least in the early stages of unfolding, we will have crippled the left electorally and politically and ideologically, that we will be in a far better position to obtain political power to navigate us through this crisis than allowing them to be in a position of power and transform us into some sort of Venezuelan Zimbabwe type state. Mm-hmm. We don't want that, obviously.
Yeah.
I don't want to be living in 1980s Rhodesia or Zimbabwe with Robert Mugabe, and I don't want to be living in 2010s Hugo Chavez, Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela, right? Yeah. And I don't want to be living in 2010s social democratic Europe either, where you have no growth, you have nihilism, you have the state running everything inefficiently and incompetently.
Yeah, I think,
what is it, 1990s Japan, where you have 30 years of zero, because the whole thing implodes and you just have lost decades, not even lost decades. So we don't want any of those three options.
Yeah, Doge hasn't failed. Doge has actually been largely successful. And you could argue that Congress is in the process of failing unless they get their crap together.
So on the question of what should Doge be doing, This is the type of stuff that
Yeah.
Doge should be doing. The regulations is the type of stuff that Doge should be doing. Anything that chips away at the left's ideological power in the form of regulations or funneling tax money to them,
Yeah.
that needs to be prioritized over anything else, because if we can't balance the budget and if it's just inevitable that the system's going to implode, there's a way for the system to implode that will result in us becoming Japan
Yeah.
or becoming Western Europe, or even worse than those two, right? Going back to Zimbabwe or Venezuela. Or there's a way for the system to implode and we turn into Javier Milei's Argentina.
Yeah.
And I would much prefer that
Yes.
than
Yes.
to 30 years of Japan or 30 years of European Union.
We'll kind of finish it with this. I actually think Doge has done a good job. One of the reasons why they did such a good job up front is because they showed the receipts. They showed the absurd nature of the spending. Now what we need from Doge is also a deep dive when they're cutting regulations. So three categories. First category is the spending. Second category is the regulatory environment that makes everything inefficient and horrible. Here's the third category. It's all of the examples that can be used to demonstrate why so many of these programs are inherently bad, right? It's not just that they're run poorly. They have horrible incentive structures, and the proof is X. And if they can give us that proof at the same time that we have people that can actually offer alternatives, this is where I had a conversation with David Hamilton, who's a senior advisor for the Doge Caucus, and we had a whole discussion on this, which is going to be coming out here, I think, next week, where we talked about this whole Doge 2.0 and okay, what do you need to do next? And I really think these three categories, right? Identify the wasteful spending, identify the bad regulations, but and right now, honestly, with the regulations, I want to see more from Doge on, okay, you cut a lot in regulations. You're telling me these savings associated with it. But one of the things that caught people's attention with the wasteful spending was just how horrible it was, just how absurd it was. We need the same thing with the regulations. We need to see give me the top 10 most absurd pieces of regulation that Doge has cut, because that will capture people's attention and let them see why this is so necessary. But that third component is all of the various examples on why these programs are run horribly by design, right? By design. Because if you can show somebody not only why is it run horribly by design, but then you can offer an alternative. If you did it this way, if we didn't have this program, but instead we had this sort of fund that was available, or we gave you the option to be able to do X, Y, and Z, this is what would be different about it. Don't just tell somebody why something shouldn't exist. Give them an alternative solution to the problem. And I think that's going to be one of the next steps for Doge going forward. And I hope we'll see more of it. But ultimately, all Doge can do is recommend. The executive branch, I think, has been doing their piece on this. We need Congress to step up and do theirs. All right. Well, I think we got to everything that we plan to talk about this. Hopefully we actually answered the question that we started off in the beginning with minimal rabbit holes, a couple. I was probably guilty of most of those this time around. Once again, thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you next episode.